Next up is Mike Taylor from Elsevier, and he is going to talk about modelling impact in an open world. Mike's been working with metrics, data and social impact for several years, until recently in Elsevier Labs, and now a Senior Product Manager in metrics in the Elsevier Metrics and Analysis Group.
So hi, my name is Mike Taylor. I work in the Elsevier Metrics Group, and I've been working in alternative metrics for 2 or 3 years. I usually describe myself as being one of Altmetrics' biggest fans. That's almost certainly the case, but I'm also one of its biggest critics. One of the things that I'm going to do today is to talk about how alternative metrics and citation-based metrics fit together in terms of how they might be able to be used to understand the reach and the impact and the capacity for scholarly research to propagate itself through society. But I'm also going to explain why it's wholly inadequate. So we know something about citations because we have 40 years of research, and there are a great number of papers and books and research groups that are dedicated to working in this area. So when we talk about citations, we have a really good insight into what they mean and what people mean when they use citations. There are a great number of citations being made every year, of course. And at the current state, well, we really hope one day that alternative metrics, which are metrics derived from, for example, citation by Twitter or usage in Mendeley, we really hope that one day those will give us a much broader picture of where society, how society is using scholarly research and so forth. But at the moment, we really can't say that. And actually, if we look at the data, the numbers of tweets, for example, to occur every year, what we find is that actually it's much more narrow, much more focused than citation-based. It's much less frequent than citation-based. It's much more biased towards the new, much more biased to high-impact journals. At the moment, the data that we get from these networks is not wide enough, not broad enough, not deep enough to use to understand scholarly citation. What it can do is, in certain cases, it can give us a wider picture of what's going on. This is, of course, embedded in the whole notion of opening up research. Not just open access, but open data and open policies and open science, and citizen science, and all these wonderful things that I'm really proud to be a very small part of. So this little graph here is one of the Snowball metrics, scholarly activity metrics. This is normalized. Each one of those lines represents the number of Mendeley and slightly-like shares being made for papers coming out of institutions. And I find it a really interesting thing because clearly if we look at that, there's a massive growth year on year. In the last year, in 2013, there was a really big rise in the number of people who were adding papers to Mendeley and slightly-like. We will see a similar jump at the end of this year. What we're doing here is we're seeing what looks like a revolutionary change in terms of the way that people are using platforms. It doesn't really tell us that there is a revolutionary change in the way that the material is being used within the scholarly network. And I think it's really important to understand those things because we see these graphs for nearly all the alternative metric channels, and they are initially very exciting when you see them. But for example, if we look at one for Twitter, we see a similarly, much steeper curve in terms of the number of tweets that are being made. But we're still talking about fewer than a fifth of papers receiving any kind of Twitter attention whatsoever. So although it's exciting to see the amount of data that's going on there, we're not yet in a position where we can say this gives us a genuinely revolutionary approach to understand what is going on in scholarly communication and scholarly publishing. If we dig a little bit more into that bucket of data that we have there in the Snowball metrics scholarly activity bucket, the Mendeley and slightly-like shares, these are mostly being used within the scholarly network. What we see here is a wider picture of people who are using material that goes beyond people who cite. So the sorts of people who use these platforms, they are at least scholarly, if not actually academic. So we have industrial people there doing research, we have PhD students, we have people who are working in a postdoc environment but not necessarily working on published output. So tools like slightly-like and Mendeley do give us a wider view of how things are being communicated and shared within a scholarly environment. But what it doesn't do is to give us a picture of how scholarly outputs are being used in a wider society. Of course, when we talk about impact, what we're talking about is a very, very technical term which is understood by people who work in the area. When we go out into society and we talk about what impact means, different disciplines have very different ideas of what that means. So a banker has one idea of what social impact might be, and a charity has another different idea. And there's some very interesting research actually in the Harvard Business Review about what happens when you try and apply different models to different fields. Arts and humanities have other different fields, and in the wider context, if we talk about impact to lay people who aren't involved in this sort of area, they will have a wide variety of different kinds of ideas. But speaking as somebody involved in metrics, we have a very, very fixed idea of what impact is. And this is entirely derived from our position within the scholarly network. And my contention is that as we open up scholarly research and communication, we have to redefine our notions of what impact are. And we also have to redefine our ideas of how we understand and track and follow scholarly communication. Because it's really important to understand that when we look at those 2.5 million tweets that were made in the year up to June, that were referring to scholarly papers, these are tweets that actually contain a hyperlink back to the original research. And this simply isn't how people talk about science, progress, technological change in society. It gives us a very small, inward-looking idea of it. And this isn't to say that it's not important, but what it is to say is that it is partial, and that people who are working in the area of metrics and alternative metrics really need to open up their arguments and understandings to understand more fully what role we play in society in terms of supporting and driving home research. Because it's really important to understand that this isn't a passive process. If we don't just communicate by writing a paper and sticking it in a journal and hoping somebody reads it. Ideas have to be driven, they have to be drivable in society. So we can put really good ideas in obscure languages and obscure journals, and people will never understand them, it will have zero impact. This isn't to say that they're not impactful or potentially impactful. We have a number of really complicated things that we need to understand. If we try and pursue a singular notion, or a singular monolithic interpretation of what impact means in a scholarly environment, then we'll inevitably fail because we're asking questions which are far too complicated to be answered by simple equations. And I can use numerous examples about where these fall down in society, but the one I have just decided to use derives from a friend of mine who works in clinical endocrine research. And she very excitedly sent me a message a couple of years ago to say that one of her papers had influenced the way that the NHS delivers endocrine treatments in certain cases. And I was really excited for it because it's what she's been working on in the last 10 years. And she sent me a link to the NHS guidelines. And I searched for her name, hoping to see her name in there. And her name isn't in there, and no paper that she has written is linked from the article. Because what happened is that you have a section which is written by an expert in the field. The expert summarises the state of research. There's no citation. It's a relatively informal document, and yet it's massively high impact. And what we see when we look at the data coming in through alternative metrics is that the kinds of data, the kinds of things that we're picking up are either formally scholarly in terms of having a link to a paper, or have a very high similarity to formal scholarly types of communication. What we don't see are the informal conversations, the informal discourse, which are actually probably the ones that are most highest impact in society, generally speaking. So, for example, the cover of the Times there from, I have a subscription, the cover of the Times there from a couple of years ago, amazing story based on an article published in Nature. Nature did an amazing job getting the story out there. When you looked on Twitter, there were something like, within a week, there were something like 500 tweets linking through to the paper, which was, fantastic. That's a really high level of tweets for a scholarly paper. But the conversation wasn't really happening with that hashtag or that link. It was happening with a very generic hashtag called prostate cancer. There's enormous gulf between the conversations that happen in society and the scholarly conversations. And the task that I kind of set myself for the rest of my career is figuring out where these things fall down, because it's really important for us as publishers to be able to understand what works and what doesn't work when we're looking at how communication works. Where are, as Vicky was just talking about, the people who can pick up and translate conversations, research, into conversations that can be easily digested. How do you prepare a paper for communicating it through radio or the websites and so forth? How do we improve the impactability of research? This is a really key question, not just for researchers in the community, but also for publishers, because that's the kind of work that publishers do. So in terms of my work inside Elsevier, I work openly. We have a number of partnerships with scholarly organisations. I'm doing a PhD with the University of Wolverhampton, funding 3 postdocs at the University of Ireland in this area. And we've been very fortunate to be participating in the Snowball Metrics open community. Thank you.